We've already established words or symbols in general as the connector between mind, noumenon, and body phenomenon. Now, why is the body more intimate in this and more dominant to this relationship? It's because the brain connects to the body using the neurological network, which is part of the body, not separate from it. Whereas when the brain accumulates stimulation, is affected by stimulation from the external world, it is affected through a medium, either through light or through air or atmosphere or through gravity or through some electromagnetism, which is what we call touch, or one of the forces of nature. Whereas the stimuli that comes from the internal sources is immediate. It's more intimate to it. It's transmitted using neural pulses much more easier, whereas external stimuli have to be converted, translated into a form that the brain can process. So of course it relates to the internal sources much more intimately than it does to the external sources. And because of this fact, the internal, because the brain is connected, is part of the hierarchy which we call organism, because organism just means a relationship of organs, brain, spleen, stomach, heart, lungs, which in turn means a relationship of cells, liver cells, lung cells, heart cells, and so on. Because this is more intimate to the brain, it is much more affected by the internal than it is by the external. So the subjective is much more seductive than the objective. The objective world, the world outside of the organism, is more threatening. It can't be controlled. It's more alienating. It's alien. Therefore, the tendency to introvert comes much more naturally to the organism than this engagement of the world directly as this threatening, uncontrolled, mysterious, uncertain otherness. Now we're getting a sense why nihilism is so effective, why it's so appealing, why it is so much more easily accepted into the mind when it speaks of things which are disconnected from the world and are esoteric. That is, they are noetic, completely noetic abstractions, noumenon with no reference to phenomenon. They're more malleable, they're more manipulated by the mind, because the mind is connected to the body, and these are constructs that are fabricated primarily from internal sources. So they are much more easily manipulated, shaped by the mind. So they are, of course, more appealing to an organism that is threatened by the external world, by an organism that finds a certainty much more appealing than uncertainty, that finds order much more attractive than disorder or an order hidden in complexity. And that's why nihilism is attractive, seductive, more so to the feeble mind, to the coward, to the idiot, to the mind incapable of coping with the world, which prefers to internalize, to seek inside what it cannot find outside. At this point, it would be wise, prudent, to define what we mean by knowing and understanding. Knowing is just data, just codified experiences. coded in order to be stored as memory, or as genes, which are a form of memory. Understanding, or I should say knowledge, is the storage of data which exhibits a pattern. The brain can only process patterns, and so it can only accumulate, assimilate, collect patterns and store them as a memory. Understanding is something further than that. It is finding patterns within the patterns. It's a refinement of consciousness. So when we say we understand something, we don't mean we know something. A computer can spout out information, data, and it has no comprehension of the data, cannot understand the data. An idiot can just memorize data. It can Google it. It can memorize it as raw material and just parrot it, just repeat it. This is not understanding. A robot can do that. A moron can do that. That is not understanding. Understanding, again, is finding a pattern within the stored, accumulated, perceived patterns. Now, sensual acuity is a big factor in this, because you cannot store what you cannot perceive. And so you need a sensual acuity. You need the courage to accept what you perceive and not to deny it, to reject it. So you don't assimilate this, you don't include this into the patterns which you then seek a pattern within. So your understanding would be hampered by your cowardice. Meaning is the word we use to describe this connection of the noumenon with the phenomenon, or the noumenon back to other noumenon, or aggregate noumena, that is, abstractions connecting back to abstractions, disregarding the real world, the phenomenon. So the most precise, the most useful meanings are the ones that connect the mind, the ideal, with the real, the mind with the action, with the world, the word with the activity, the behavior. The meanings don't matter only to an organism which has its self-preservation guaranteed, and its rights as something that are God-given, or are institutionalized. They are guaranteed by institutions, which are just another way of saying God. In other words, the meaning of the very word meaning is warped by institutionalized sheltering, the protective shield, which gives the impression to the organism, cultivates the delusion that there is no standard outside of its own mental fabrications, that it does not have to adapt to anything outside of itself, that its judgments are not adherent to anything outside of its pleasure, what makes it happy, what it prefers, what it has a taste for. This is the very source of the bullshit in the debate between subjective and objective, or between the nurture and nature debate. Just from what we've said so far in this second part, and the two last parts and this part, we've already get the feeling that words are not only important, they are fundamental in philosophy and thinking, and not something to dismiss as some morons do casually because they want to avoid the implications, the need to define words. They just pull out of their arse, and because they feel good, and they like to believe they feel good, and they prefer to believe they are important and they have meaning without understanding them. It's because of this fact that words, if they are attached to reality, if they are restricted, if they refer to the noumenon, which is in turn restricted by the order of the real world, which is external to the mind, is because of this fact that cowards and moderns, imbeciles, nihilists, refuse to go into that. They prefer to use words as if they were some magical symbol, some talisman that can heal, that can solve things, that can offer solutions, that can make people feel good. In other words, that can add to the pleasure principle. Because that's their only interest. They don't really care about how the world is. They are only interested in how they can survive within it. And once the survival is guaranteed, all they care about is how they can pleasure themselves in it. Because as Schopenhauer said, life swings as a pendulum, backward and forward, between pain and boredom. End quote. Now there's a very rational reason he said this. So we cannot just dismiss him out of hand just because we want to. What he's saying here is that the brain has evolved to deal with challenges. The brain is an organ, like all the other organs, meant to facilitate survival. So once the brain is liberated from this primary need, it begins to atrophy. Now the way the brain feels this atrophy is boredom. So the brain is either stressed by its function to fulfill needs, the organic needs that are streaming up to it from internal sources, and threats which are streaming into it from external sources. This produces stress in the nervous system, which leads to the accumulation of stress as a form of preparation in the fear flight mechanism, which is, if it's not expunged, it can be detrimental to the organism itself. So if none of this stress is present, then the mind, the organ, having no other function, begins to atrophy. Now the feeling of the brain atrophying is boredom. With no challenges, the brain begins to get bored. And this is more common amongst this is ironic, the more dull-minded, the dim-witted, because they have no other interest except to fulfill basic needs, like feeding themselves, or protecting themselves, or pleasuring themselves, finding pleasure. They have no other interests to occupy their minds. They are the first to experience boredom. In other words, they are the first that begin to atrophy.